Okay, I think that we have filled the auditorium. Yay! Wonderful. Thank you all for attending today. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Memorial Art Gallery. My name is Jessica Martin. I'm the curator in charge, the curator of American art, and it's in that capacity that I have had the great pleasure of organizing the Path to Paradise Judith Schaechter's stained glass art. Shortly, I'll introduce and welcome Judith Schaechter to the stage, and she will give a fabulous talk. If any indication is the opening slide. After that, there'll be an opportunity for questions afterwards. And after that, I welcome you to go back into the gallery where there would be ongoing tours between the hours of 2 and 3. You can jump in to a tour at any time. At 3 o'clock, right back here in the auditorium, the Rochester-based quintet 5x5 will perform 4 original music compositions inspired by Judith's work. So art begetting art. It's a beautiful thing. Finally, at 4 o'clock, you'll have an opportunity to meet the artist. She's doing a book signing in the pavilion. The exhibition catalog, produced by RIT Press here in Rochester, published by RIT Press in conjunction with the Memorial Art Gallery. You can pick one up in our gallery store and then join us in the pavilion for a signing. So that's at 4. Okay, now that I've got your afternoon booked, I'll turn to the important business of introducing our speaker. From her start in the 1980s, Judith Schaechter has stretched the medium of stained glass into a potent and incisive art form for the 21st century. Over 37 years and in more than 225 stained glass panels, Judith has developed her mastery of the medium, her singular style, and her artistic philosophy. For her rigorous dedication to her medium and her meticulous process, she has described her practice in stained glass as an extreme sport. And the work itself evokes extreme reactions. For her provocative rebelliousness and her unequivocal love of beauty and the grotesque, Judith has been called a post-punk stained glass sorceress. I did not come up with that name, I wish I had, but I like to use it. And viewing her work has been described as a thrilling and disorienting experience, like seeing an old master painting of a car crash. Over the last 3.5 decades, Judith has attained significant art world recognition with prestigious awards including 2 NEA Visual Artists Fellowships, a Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award, a Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a U.S. Artists Fellowship, and an American Craft Council College of Fellows Award. Most recently, in 2018, her papers and digital archives were accepted into the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. You'll find her work is represented in over a dozen museums, including those lending to this exhibition very generously, in addition to MAG, the Carnegie Museum of Art, Corning Museum of Glass, Mint Museum, Museum of Arts and Design, Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Speed Art Museum, and the Toledo Museum of Art. Judith Schaechter's stained glass panels are visual seductions, alternative visions of beauty, and radical statements of female experience. Please join me in welcoming Judith Schaechter.
Thank you. I think I'm going to be sick. First, I want to thank you, Jess, for that beautiful introduction. I want to thank you for everything you've done, and Jonathan Binstock, the Memorial Art Gallery, and all the supporters and lenders for which this would not be possible. I am overwhelmingly grateful. All right, I'm going to start the lecture now. I'll tell you, it's sort of cobbled together in 2 parts, the beginning and the end. And I have a couple of moments where there's presenter notes, which I feel like that's totally lame, because I should know this material by now. But you never know what's going to happen. All right, I'm from Philadelphia. That's the Rocky statue. We won the Super Bowl a couple years ago. Okay? We all want you to know that. So the beginning of the lecture covers my background. That is a real picture of me. Back in the day, I started early. I grew up in the 1970s. This is what I remember of the 1970s. I did a social studies report on Patricia Hearst. And then I think I later, did I do that? Anyway, I'm putting my hands behind my back. I think I later conflated Patti Smith with Patty Hearst and wanted to become something like that. All right, so I think in some ways I am the result of a perfect storm of events that conspires to form an artist, one who is very comfortable being denied comfortable definitions. For one thing, I am the result of a mixed marriage. On my mother's side, my family goes back to the Francis of Ipswich, a ship full of disgruntled Puritan colonists that landed in Roxbury, Massachusetts in 1634. On my father's side, that's the right-hand side, I am a first-generation American. My father was raised in Milan, Italy, and Quito, Ecuador, but he is of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. I am not religious, and I do not believe in an afterlife, but I do imagine that there is a committee of grandmas, and they never had the chance to actually express their demi-monde artistic tendencies, but I feel sometimes that they are cheering me on from the beyond. And this, do I have access to this? All right, I don't know. I'm not going to use the pointer. The one who says, "You go, girl," that is my mother's mother. That's my actual grandma. She used to make me snickerdoodles. And this is one of her paintings. So on my mother's side, there was a lot of women, men maybe, who had artistic tendencies. My grandmother taught me to oil paint when I was about 8 years old, and this is a painting that I did around then. That was the first oil painting I ever did. Actually, significantly, that was a newspaper behind that syrup bottle, and I put flowers on it, thus predestining me to a life of putting flowers on things. So this is my mother, circa 1940. She really, literally is Dorothy Gale from Kansas, except she's from Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And that is my father becoming naturalized. My father likes to say, that guy is wasted in that picture. So there you go. My mother was a pianist of some note. She played concerts at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum when I was growing up, and she was also a social worker. Eventually, she became the director of a school for severely autistic children. My father was a microbiologist and was the head of microbiology at Tufts University for 35 years. By the time they had children, my parents had moved to Newton, Massachusetts, and were sort of borderline socialists, rabid atheists. And I think that this is important for many reasons. One being that the history of stained glass is intimately tied to Christianity. And even when it's not, it still conjures up notions of spirituality. To work in stained glass, you're never really going to escape its ability to transmit light in a way that appears to be literally enlightening, to paraphrase the Abbot Suger. If you don't know who the Abbot Suger is, he is the 12th century abbot and designer of Saint Denis, the first truly Gothic cathedral. And he said, stained glass is enlightenment embodied. Stained glass is profoundly visually exciting and moving, even when it's deployed in terrible ways, which is, yeah, I made that. Anyway, a lot of stained glass can be dreadful, Because I had no religious history, not even so much as vague suggestions of spirituality, which were all lumped in with superstition and pretty much were made fun of in my house, I don't think I saw a real stained glass window until I was a teenager. And because of this, I had no preconceptions, no real associations with the medium when I first encountered it in art school. And I think that was an incredible gift. It allowed me the ignorant hubris to imagine that I could invent this medium for myself. Another important aspect of my childhood, I'll get back to stained glass later, that has a direct impact on how I think about art is my little brother. My little brother was born normal but had encephalitis when he was 9 months old. This left him with brain damage to both Broca's and Wernicke's area. And this event obviously transformed the whole family. My mother had a lifelong interest in language development, and my brother's severe delay has had the effect that I am interested in conversations about how visual thinking intersects, or doesn't intersect, as the case may be, with verbal thinking. All right, so back to my early influences. My father used to take me to the Boston MFA a lot, and I remember seeing this painting there and being horrified and transfixed at the same time. My dad being European, it was, you got to bring the kid to a museum like once a week, and that was awesome. And this was the 70s. There was no sense that you had to hide this type of material from children. And I'm very, very grateful for that, because while it was a horrifying image to me as a little kid, it was something I think, if I can recreate my memories at all, I understood that art could be very powerful. And so in that moment, no, just kidding. This was a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale book that I got from, it was my mother's, and I loved images like this. And these are some shrunken heads from the exceedingly politically incorrect museum in Osage County, Oklahoma, called the Woolaroc, which I highly recommend. I wished ardently when I saw these that they could be my dolls. I was a doll abuser. I remember when my mother got me, I had a lot of oral surgery as a kid because I have giant horse teeth and a really tiny jaw. I had to have a bunch of molars removed, and so that my mother got me a Malibu Skipper. I never got a Barbie. Anyway, Malibu Skipper was as close as I got. And to celebrate Malibu Skipper, I tortured Tammy to death. Bad Tammy. I can directly associate my childhood art with the art I did as an adult, oddly enough. I haven't developed yet artistically. I'm waiting for that to happen. Another example. On a personal note, I know I said nothing personal, but I'm deeply phobic of throwing up. So I think these images come from that. That on the right is Winston Churchill in his coffin, drawn by me when I was 4. I know, that always gets a laugh, but you know what? It's not that glamorous a story. We were living in England, and I was sick, so my parents propped me up in front of the TV, and it was Winston Churchill's funeral on, all 2 of the BBC stations. And as I recall, I was very concerned that Winston was going to be cold in that box, so those are pillows and blankets keeping him warm. I always drew frowning princesses, and I also reversed a lot of my letters. There's that. You've seen that. Around the time I started to pubesce, I got interested in caricature and cartoons and beauty contests. Mad Magazine was a huge influence on me. I just want to say, I showed this to my class last week, and one of my students said he's going to name his autobiography Psychedelic Pictures for Daddy. I thought that was great. Someone ought to use it. So yes, in my household, there was a lot of culture, a lot of aspiration towards culture, but there was also, I think, the Oklahoma influence, an inability to, or a resistance to discriminating between high culture and low culture, which also served to make the perfect storm of art. Here's an early self-portrait I did with my night brace, and that's me playing with dolls. And here's some paintings I did as a teenager. On the left, I was attempting to channel my inner Albrecht Dürer. You know, I'm not even close. Have you ever seen how good Dürer was when he was like way younger than that? It's just embarrassing. When I was a teenager, my mother aided and abetted my stealing a book from the Boston Public Library on how to tat lace. As I recall, her exact words were, "No one else will ever want to learn this. So if you want it, just keep it, and we'll pay the fine." So I taught myself how to tat lace. Tatting was actually very hard to learn, and once you get the hang of it, it takes a sort of ridiculously huge amount of time. An inch of tatting is the result of about an hour of work, and you're not going to get that time back again. So a doily like this, which is about this big, took like months. When one is engaged in this type of activity, a lot goes through your head, and the number one thought is, like, why am I doing this? And I think actually that sort of speaks to my early craft tendencies and my use of art to sublimate all forms of energy into art. I mentioned at the outset that I'm sort of a perfect storm of sorts, one that would inevitably produce an artist. So to review, because there will be a test tomorrow, the factors were I did not fit comfortably into any social identity, especially when it came to religion. I had some native ability to draw a picture, so I was getting sort of positive feedback from my efforts themselves. I had the support of my parents, including ultimately financial support when I graduated, being really terrible at sports. And I was not the best student academically. I was always just sort of squeaking by. Other factors included not having preconceptions about stained glass. I just read a really interesting book called How Art Works by a psychologist named Ellen Winter, and she talks about some of the biological factors that contribute to people being artists, and being left-handed, which I am, is an asset. So all of that led directly to art school. And in art school, I learned several things. I learned, don't be decorative, don't be illustrative, don't be crafty. But most of all, I learned, don't be sentimental, kitsch, or cliche. Under any circumstances, there will be no sad clowns. I started out as a painting major, and this was a still life. I think it's pretty funny because I did all that art as a kid, and it's pretty easy to observe that children do not have a lot of creative hang-ups. And there's this sort of coincidence that by the time you get to art school, all your creative hang-ups should be firmly in place. And as an instructor myself, I hear a lot of I used to really like art, but art school ruined it for me. It's like, ow. We did about one semester of this stuff in sophomore year, and then the teacher said, okay, from now on you can do whatever you want. And I remember thinking, oh, that's awesome, because I don't like doing still lives and nude models, and whatever I want to do, it's going to be awesome. But I think like that. And I did not know anything about what it was going to look like at all. Nothing. There was no images in my mind. And it was very, very, very difficult at first for a little while. But what ended up happening was that I discovered glass. This is the very first stained glass window I ever made. Those of you who work with materials, you know, when you're starting, you're having that thing like, is it me or is it this stuff? Because it's not coming out like the picture. So that's the very first stained glass window I did. People sometimes ask, how did I discover stained glass? I was a painting major, and the stained glass studio was next to the graduate painting studios at RISD, and I just happened to walk in there one day and see what they were doing, and I thought, well, that looks like fun, I think I'll try it. And then I switched my major. This is a very, very early student piece with a blown glass element. I made the mold for the head. I have blown glass. There's always someone who will consider me to be a complete fraud if I haven't blown glass myself. So I have, okay? You don't want to see it. And this is a piece from my senior thesis show when I had finally discovered my true calling, which was to be disgusting and provocative. These were really tiny. They were 5 inches by 10 inches. So what had happened that sort of changed me from being a painter to a stained glass artist? It's a whole confluence of events. For one thing, I had taken advanced placement art history twice at that point. I was interested in art history, I love art history, but I was very awed by it, very intimidated by it, very inhibited by it. AP art history does not include any stained glass, except for maybe a de rigueur picture of Saint-Chapelle or something. And I was understanding that there was a lot of gravitas with being a painter. It's very serious business being an artist. And it was totally intimidating. So meanwhile, I'm taking this stained glass elective class, and there's no pressure on me whatsoever because no one mentioned anything about there being a history. And at the same time, and did I mention, the painting teacher was saying things like, you know what, you can't paint figures because figures are for illustrators. And it's like, ooh, bummer. You can't, that really sucks, because that's pretty much what I was hoping to do. And, you know, beauty was a very dirty word. Decorative was even beyond a horrible notion. Like, if I was myself now, then, and I'd gone up to my teacher and told him that I was a militant ornamentalist, I think he would have had a real problem with it. So he was giving me a lot of challenge. I don't want to say totally bad things about him, because if he hadn't intervened, I would still be doing things, I would still be aspiring to be Roger Dean, the record cover artist for Yes. Or, so he broke me of some pretty evil habits. So all along, my whole life, I've been doodling in the margins of my papers obsessively, and I never ascribed any value or meaning to this activity whatsoever, because all I ever got was a lot of grief for doing it. Even in art school, no one ever said, hey, look at that stuff you're doing. So when I took the stained glass class, it occurred to me that stained glass was a garbage medium for idiots, and that it didn't matter if I had anything serious or interesting or profound to say. I could say whatever stupid thing was on my mind. So I decided to interpret my doodles. And that was the moment that I became uncritiquable. I like to call it my... I went to the wizard and asked him for some ability to make a painting, and it turned out it was there the whole time. I just didn't know it. And it was very liberating, because when someone is that in love with their project or whatever, it didn't matter what I heard in critique. I mean, you could have said anything to me and I was like, yeah, whatever. It felt like the tap of a dull knife on the heel of my boot. I was... You know, when you're in love and someone says, like, I don't like your boyfriend's sweater, you go like, okay. So I decided to proceed with glass. I moved to Philadelphia. These are the Philadelphia signifiers. Please come visit. And now the rest of the lecture will take the format of frequently asked questions. And they are, where do you get your ideas? How do you make your work? What is your creative process? Why is your work so depressing? And why glass? No, the very, very few people have come up to me actually and said, why is your work so depressing? I tend to hear it from like family members who say, I overheard that guy asking about that. It's like, thanks for letting me know. All right, the number one question any artist gets is, where do you get your ideas? And I have determined that there are 4 major ways I get ideas, and those are by drawing, by stealing, by mashups and cross-pollination, and from the glass itself. So I will talk about these separately. I do not actually have ideas. I've never had an idea in my whole life. All of my work or a lot of my work, I literally draw it out of me. I like the fact that the word draw means to pull. So these drawings, I'm not seeing them in my head and recording them like a screen grab. I'm sort of scribbling and it's happening spontaneously. So there's sketchbooks in the show. You can go check it out. That's how a lot of them start. I need to be distracted in order to draw. Now you can see what happened at the crafts faculty meeting on October 30th, 2008. It was, I swear I'm actually listening to the faculty meeting, but they're very productive times for me. So are conferences. So what you see on the left is the sort of raw material. On the right, that's a Photoshop document where I have input the drawings and sort of clean them up. And I make these basically like sheets, like those Victorian scrapbooking stuff. And this is a piece that was generated that way, very directly. I do not usually work with assistants because I'm a total control freak. And in this case, I did have an assistant, and the bottle itself is made with a photographic stencil, and so the assistant made the bottles, and I made the creatures. Here's some more doodles. This was a Title IX meeting. And that leads directly to a piece like this. You know, I don't have a lot of source material to show you about this piece. If you have questions about individual pieces, I would be happy to answer them. Sometimes it's hard for me to remember. I will say, I had the idea to do the garden. I had the sketch of the woman. They were separate. Whatever happened where I decided to put the two of them together happened in a nanosecond. And I can't recreate the moment because I can't remember it. It was pre-verbal. It happened very, very quickly. But because I have like this enormous amount of material that I'm shuffling around, usually digitally, but I'm old enough that there wasn't digital. So I was doing it with cutouts from Xerox places, and just sort of moving the images around and trying different things and seeing what looks like it's going to work. The second way I get ideas is by stealing them. So you'll see some pieces that aren't in the show. Maybe at some point I should tell you why the show is called The Path to Paradise, but not now. The exhibition here has 40 works in it, but I've actually made 214. So I'm showing some that aren't in the show. On the right is a window from Tattersall, England, a church called Holy Trinity. I'm sure you all know about the Protestant Reformation. They went around and they smashed a lot of glass, and I'm just guessing this is true. I know there's some people here who can probably answer this, but it got cold and rainy in the church, and they didn't have a board-up service, so they dug up all the scraps and they put them back together again and stuck them back in the window. but they didn't do it necessarily the way it was originally. So you have some word salad. This is called Self-Portrait of Someone Else, and it has the exact same cutting lines as the one from Tattersall Holy Trinity. These raindrops, there's the Life Ecstatic in the show has a raindrop motif in it. They seem to be a big thing for me these days. And they're directly from the Tattersall Holy Trinity. Jazz Funeral for Dee Dee was inspired by this Russian Lubach print that you see at the top. The mice were made with a linoleum block that I put glass paint on and just sort of smushed it on the glass, and the glass paint fires on. I'll talk technique in a minute. And this was to memorialize my cat Dee Dee, who I love cats, but not so much Dee Dee. I think there might have been a little overcompensating going on. But Dee Dee was sweet, and she deserved better. I was told as a young artist that I would someday be influenced by Japanese prints, because that happens to everybody. You know, this was before there was any sort of discussion of sort of colonizing kind of attitudes. It would be interesting now to have that conversation. I didn't understand Japanese prints at all. I just didn't get them until one day I did, and then I was in love and decided to go for it. And this piece, called A Ship on Her Shoulder, was based on the art test. This was reproduced, well, this was in all the old comic books that I used to read, but it was reproduced in Juxtapose magazine. I think it was Juxtapose. And I decided to do it. I don't think I ever sent it in, but I did do the pirate, right? So you're going to see a connection between these in mere moments. So I then rotated the sitting pirate. It's just rotated. I didn't change anything at all, except that in Photoshop, I'm like pointing at this like you can see what I'm doing. I took that boat out and put it on his back. And then I turned it into a woman. And that is sort of how that idea came to be. And apropos of stealing ideas, this is called Child Bride, and it was accidentally stolen from my friend Susan Hagen. We have like an agreement where I always mention her. So she didn't ask for that. I told her I would do it. I saw this piece by Susan, and I really loved it, and I think what happened was my brain said, okay, Judith, you're going to leave the studio, and you'll never remember seeing it. 2 months from now, you're going to design a piece based on that idea and make it yourself. And you'll never have to say you're sorry because you forgot everything. So that's pretty much what happened. Susan, of course, was influenced by the Green Man, the Celtic character who crops up in gardens these days. And also as the Jolly Green Giant, which I find interesting. And this is an extremely recent piece from just a few months ago called Efflorescence. And this piece is here to make the point that sometimes I steal ideas that I don't even know about. So I made the piece, and a friend of mine said, oh, it's Danae. And I'm like, oh, sure, who's Danae? And this is one of the 6 versions painted by Titian. And I never knew much about it, but she was, golden showers, the whole thing. So all these myths are a little dodgy. I think I could make a case that by decontextualizing everything and spitting it out, I'm doing something? I don't know. I'd have to really fancy that up. Anyway, one day, I was sitting on my toilet, and I had a vision. And the vision was Christina's world, and the toothpaste tube was Christina. This is a painting that I think is pretty much a guilty pleasure. Like, if you're a serious scholar of art, you're not really supposed to like this that much. But I love it. And here is my version, only in my version she doesn't have polio, but she has frontal lobe epilepsy. And here's a sort of a standard theft of mine. I'm an avid collector of images. I collect pictures of women tied to horses. You know what, I took out about 6 slides so as to not take all day. And there's a close-up of the piece. This piece is actually really tiny. It's about this big. So the flowers are at the top less than 1/4 of an inch. And then there is Dream of the Fisherman's Wife. This is to illustrate the fact that some of these things end up being weird mashups from art history. So Dream of the Fisherman's Wife involves an octopus and Lars von Trier, and his movie Breaking the Waves. I don't want to lose your friendship. I know we're all friends, but I liked that movie a lot. And I think that this character is that character in some way. So I guess you're probably starting to figure out there's some sort of subconscious thing going on with this stuff. What happens when you combine a magazine cover commemorating the World War I deceased with a performing seal? You get this window. And there's a close-up. What happens when you combine this natural history illustration of a mushroom and I don't know what all that other stuff is, and St. Patrick is a very recent piece called Isola. At some point, I'll take a brief digression to talk about that tabloid Le Petit Journal, which is from, I think it's from France. It might be from like Thailand, actually. But all of the images are available on the internet, and when I saw them, first of all, I downloaded all of them. And then I thought, I will never, ever, ever have to have another idea. I will just interpret these from here on in without any thinking on my part ever again. And I'll just change all the characters into women. So this is the piece called The Floor. Now, the floor also represents a cross-pollinated piece because this was also the Christina's World piece was supposed to have this floor in it, and somehow they got moved around. I had the idea, I've spent a lot of time reading about the American Civil War. For a couple years, that's the only thing I read about. And this was sort of when we were at war with Iraq. And I thought, I would like to do something about the theme. I don't consider myself to be a political artist. I'm a political person in that I vote and all that stuff. I think the role of art is more intimate, and like it's not like you're changing millions of people's minds at once, like at a rally or a rock concert. It speaks to you quietly, one to one. So, and also I think the audience for art doesn't need to be lectured on morals by me, because I'm not sure I have any. And second of all, they probably agree with me already. So I did want to make a statement about war, perhaps the American Civil War, and about how men gave up their lives, but women gave up their sons. And so I did this weird thing, and I did a 3D computer model of a skull. And then I reproduced it 1,000 times and turned it into a pile. I generated a JPEG, and then I drew it. That's the medieval way to do a stained glass window. I collect pictures of skull mountains. Ultimately, though, so this was my idea on the left, and this is the piece I made on the right. This piece actually was given to the Hermitage, so it's in Russia now. And I didn't put her on the pile of skulls because I thought it was just too didactic. I did make the pile of skulls, and that is a separate piece. This, you know, I don't very often crop the human figure. I think I have object permanence issues. So to me, to crop a human figure is like, it's an act of horrendous violence. Also, I was kind of getting off on this piece because the heads were on the bottom and the feet were on the top, and it seemed like the world gone mad, you know? So this is called Monument to Man's Accomplishments on this planet. All right, so another mashup. We have this famous trompe-l'oeil painting, and also Peale's Museum, and this political cartoon about the Pope. And that all turned into this window, somehow, and my outfit. So I will be talking technically, I think, very, very soon, but the Cliff Notes, if you have to leave early, they're done in layers, and these are the 2 layers for this. That's all there is. There's nothing else mysterious going on. When you put it together, it looks like that. Another mashup is immigration policy. You know, I will tell you, I'm sorry I named it that. I have very strong feelings about immigration policies, but this window is not really a reflection of them. Soon after I finished this window, a friend of mine who has a dog said to me, like, Judith, how could you do that image? And now I sort of get that enough that I don't hear it anymore. But I thought I should be able to answer this dear friend who loves dogs. And I thought for a while, I don't even remember if I answered her when she was there, but I thought, you know, I don't care about those people on that boat, but I am damn upset about that dog. And this is, to me, a piece about habitat destruction, climate change. I consider animals to be innocent all the time, and it infuriates me. I think that I'm attempting to come to terms with some of this stuff. The mashup was this painting from a while ago, and this print from also a while ago. Back when all artists were named anonymous. That's my favorite artist. And then there is Beached Whale, which is in the show, obviously. Now, Beached Whale, you may not know, is plopped into this painting by Martin Johnson Heade. There's another Martin Johnson Heade in the collection here. He's one of my favorite artists. And also this. I collect pictures of beached whales. The whale, by the way, I did the whale so many times in Photoshop and pencil before figuring out how to actually make the stained glass window. It was a blue whale, and then it had to be a sperm whale. And I found out that, like, the head of a sperm whale is filled with this stuff. Why they call it a sperm whale? And the last way I get inspiration is from the material itself. So this is a glass piece about glass. Here's a close-up. And here's what it looks like apart. So the left and the right go together to make the far right. So the blue and the red, you just put them together and you get the image on the right. And that is the segue to the technical section of the lecture. How do you make your stuff? The second number one question artists get is, how do you make your stuff? All right, so I would like to draw your attention to the figure of the human being. On the left here, I didn't touch anything. On the left here is the 3 panels of glass together. And the 3 panels of glass are on the other side. So the type of glass I'm using is called flash glass. It's way better in German, by the way. It's Überfanglas. So I take the Überfanglas. The glass it's hand-blown by people who drink beer for breakfast, and the sheets are about 2 feet by 3 feet. They're made originally in cylinders that are flattened out. And it's absolutely a gorgeous, gorgeous material. And the characteristic of the glass is that it has a very, very thin veneer of very intense color. The thickness is about the thickness of a piece of paper, maybe a little thicker. If it's English antique, it's substantially thicker. No, it just depends on the glass itself and the glass blowing process. So you can remove the layer of color. I'll get into that later. All right, I almost had a thought that was ahead of its time. So I am applying a stencil. The piece that has the red on it, the red and the black, that piece was all red. It would have looked to you like a solid piece of red. I put a stencil on it. The area that looks kind of Jackson Pollock-y, that is a stencil made with Elmer's glue. You just squeeze it on and let it dry. It's sandblasted. Sandblasting is basically shooting sand out of a gun. It's disgusting. And it's the only piece of equipment that makes this not a DIY process, really. And the rest was done with contact paper. Then there's a blue on clear layer and a pink on clear layer. The red on clear layer and the blue on clear layer have black and gray on it. The black and gray is paint. Don't pop your peas. That's what they say when you are going to microphone school. The paint is, it's called vitreous enamel, and it fires on in a kiln at about 1,200 degrees. It's really, really low tech. There's a lot of weird arcane mystery surrounding this. That's to make sure that no one ever gets involved, because stained glass just has too many practitioners. And we have to weed some of them out. So, the pink glass is kind of trivially interesting, because pink glass is made with gold. And so like a square foot of the stuff costs $50 wholesale. It's really expensive. And I think that explains the myth of a million dead virgins right there. Although it's supposedly the red glass, I think it has to be the pink. Anyway, that yellow is not actually silver stain, but most of my yellow is silver stain, and silver stain is the origin of the word stained glass. Silver stain is silver nitrate mixed into a powder of gamboge clay, and you paint it on, and you stick it in the kiln, and you bring it up to about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it cools off, and you wash it off, because it comes out of the kiln, it looks like nothing happened. But when you wash it off, the silver nitrate has sunk and actually stained the glass. So it ain't stained glass unless it's got the stain on it. And that was an innovative development in, I guess, around 1200. Someone scream yes. Okay, I'll just take that as a yes. Around maybe 1100. Silver stain was invented in the ancient Near East, but they started using it commonly in stained glass windows in the early medieval times. And it was a radical improvement, because when you want to change colors in stained glass, you usually have to put a lead bar and a whole other piece of glass in there. So this allowed there to be a profusion of blonde people in stained glass. Another use of the plating that I do is to not match the layers exactly. So this one, the layers are done pretty much like a color separation in printmaking. In this piece, they are similar, but not quite the same for the figure. So the two on the left combine to make the image on the right. Another example that's in the exhibition is Feral Child, and I'll show you the bird area here. So the top piece is the red and the blue just being sandblasted for the first time. Down here, after the glass is sandblasted, I start doing other processes to it. I have never, ever met a technique that was too tedious for me, or too dreadfully boring or difficult. That's like catnip. I love that. So I will tell you, part of me is just delighted that I'm capable of learning anything at all. So I sandblast in part to remove the color, but also to prepare the surface. So you see it's not all sandblasted to clear. What I'm doing is making it sort of cloudy so that when I go into it with basically dental drills, jeweler tools, and hand files. There is a surface that will grab the diamonds. All those tools, like Dremel tools, flexible shaft engraving tools, and files, have a diamond surface, which is not exotic at all. They're like $7 for a drill bit. It's nothing. And the engraving tools allow me to make what appear to be lines, white lines. And the files, I will show you more about filing later, so I'll get to that in a bit. The birds in the feral child have 3 layers. So there's a red layer, a blue layer, and a gold-pink layer. The red layer has black paint and silver stain on it. Oddly enough, this will be odd for anyone who does ceramics or glass. The red stained glass is really stable in the kiln. So I like to do all the stuff to the red glass because I know how it's going to behave. Blue glass sometimes is less reliable, and pink is completely unreliable, and I paid $10 billion for it. And that's what it looks like together. This, I will say this again later, this process is somewhat spontaneous. I don't plan it out ahead of time. Even the one of the woman with the bear, I had only a black and white drawing that I was working from. So for her head, we have 3 different layers of blue on clear, red on clear with the vitreous paint and the silver stain, and the pink on clear. And here's where I'll talk more about filing. This piece, New Ghost. This is Berlin. And this is the various stages of filing that figure. Filing that figure took about a week, working all the time, and mostly it's hand-filed. So I think that's in the video. Is it in the video? I won't watch the video. It's me. It's too embarrassing. So the file, it looks like a nail file, and this is the one thing that I invented. I was playing around with the flexible shaft engraving tools one day, and it occurred to me that I could unplug. They're diamond tools, and diamonds will abrade glass whether or not they're connected to an electricity source or not. It's just power, and so I started using the drill bits for the engraving tools, but they aren't appropriate, and I thought something like a file would be better, and it turns out that bead makers use these files to get rid of these sharp edges so they don't open a vein while they're working. And this turned out to be the most satisfying technique I could possibly imagine. I mean, this is what I want to do all day long, every day. It really hurts your arm, but I mean, boy, I'm just so gratified at the end of the day. It's not funny. It keeps me out of trouble, too. This piece, The Life Ecstatic, you can tell is based on the Google Map pin. That's my house. Don't visit. And here's what the background looked like in various stages. So this, I'll just show you the piece again. So I'm showing you the red surround the figure, around the figure. And again, I don't know what it's supposed to look like ahead of time. I'm improvising with the glass. I have a vague idea. And this piece, which features the exact same figure as this piece, that is because I originally made that figure, and I thought it was the best engraving I'd ever done, but I really needed this one to have a full-color figure, and in order to create all those layers, I'd have to remove all of that engraving, so I just made a second one. And the bird section in progress looks like this. So that's the red and the blue, just basically sandblasted. And here's the red, all worked and painted with silver stain on it. And that's the blue. The blue has either pink enamel, sometimes I use pink oil paint, which does not fire on and would be not good to put in sunlight. But I can't tell if this is pink enamel, which would be okay in sunlight. It's in a light box. Or pink paint. And the fish area looks like that, taken apart. And there's this. So I realize it's really hard to talk about techniques. They have some demo pieces in there. I think that's helpful. So here's a close-up of the rondel from immigration policy. I got really interested in these rondel and quarry pieces from the post-Protestant Reformation English history. Like, basically, they smashed all the stained glass windows, but they didn't. There wasn't a call to make fresh new ones, so the stained glass factories went out of business. And so people who wanted, and there was a secular market, so they invented this style that basically was heavily reliant on black paint and silver stain. And a quarry is the little diamond shapes, and the rondel is the round thing. So I'm going to show you the rondel in progress. So that's the 3 stages of painting the rondel. It's just glass paint. It's actually on window glass. Don't kill me. Some people don't like that. And this is that's obviously not the same piece, but that's a picture of the drill that I used to engrave with. I have 3 of them, and that one was really hard to find. I found it in Japan. It's a Nakanishi Emax Evolution for you tech heads out there. And it's really fun to engrave eyeballs because it's disturbing. But once the paint is fired on, you can engrave the paint off as well. So I do that. And here are the 2 more iterations of the painting of the rondel for that piece. Now, most of my work is assembled with copper foil, which is the technique that Tiffany invented. This window was leaded, which was sort of done as a personal challenge from a dear friend who was busting me for not leading anymore. So I decided I would start leading again. Lead, I know lead makes people very worried, but you really have to eat it to get lead poisoning, and I am told it's delicious. So it's tempting. But ordinarily, I solder them together like this. That's also lead, so you're not getting out of this. And that's the Battle of Carnival in Lent. All right, the next question I get is, what is your creative process? Now, I feel like I have addressed creative process as I've gone, so this is just to tie up a few loose ends. I change my mind a lot. On average, I do the figure 2 or 3 times in glass before I'm satisfied. This piece, I made the whole piece twice. The second version is the one on the right. I actually like the first version better. I hope the owner of the other one is not in the room. I think it all worked out. I would just want to say, as a technical aside, that I had this idea of doing an actual color separation to make that chandelier, and that is how I made those chandeliers with sandblasting. Trying to do CMYK separations, you have to use the biggest dot screen, so it kind of ruins the effect. The piece You Are Here in the show, these are the 3 other figures that did not make the cut. I turned them into small study panels. And this is the final version. And then the piece, The Cold Genius, which is also in the show, I realized 4 times before I could finally stop fighting with it. The bottom right is the one in the show. It can be a really agonizing process. I don't mind that. It's not like I think there's this sense that, like, oh, Judith knows it'll work out because it's worked out 213 times before this, right? And it's like, no, this time it's different, and it's not going to work out. And I completely freak out. Every time, it's like brand new. So that's the completed piece. This piece actually, it was in the show also, it had has a whole different resolution on the upper right. I think that a lot of times I get flustered because I'm thinking too far ahead in the process about the end result, when I should be picturing cereal bowls full of little tiny rocks, and that would set me on the right path. So this piece at this point, I can generate an image on pieces of stained glass in any number of ways. And I don't have to make each rock separate if I want them to be different colors. But I deliberately did that because I wanted to make a statement about how much it matters to me that I'm willing to do that. Not me personally, but that anyone would care enough to do that. So the piece, ultimately, that's it in reflected light. So the original one has this on the upper right, that resolution. That was Friday night. Saturday morning, I smashed it out with a hammer because if you have ever taken apart a copper foil stained glass window, you know that the most effective way to do it is with a hammer. It does not want to come apart at all. People think glass is fragile. It's not fragile. And just as an aside, this comes from my vast collection of crawling hairy men. An art motif I'm sure you're all familiar with. And that's the sketch. I do not need to have a sketch to make these pieces. I need a cartoon to know how to cut the glass, which is just a line drawing. I like to draw, so sometimes I draw. In addition to being the ideal way of expressing control freakish, sort of black belt level nerdy perfectionism, my work also lets me show off my more spontaneous side. For instance, this piece, which is based on that drawing of an anchoress or an anchorite. Anchorites like to be walled into the church to prove their devotion. Kind of like being an artist, only without the actual wall. So the top section of this piece was pretty much worked off that drawing and then done spontaneously. So I was adding stuff to it, changing shapes and colors, and those are the 3 plates that go up to make that thing. And oh my goodness, I have some more details, because I can't get enough, I don't know. All right, so why is your work so depressing? I've never seen any sad art before. And I'm sure you haven't either. Not any, none. I have no clue why anyone might possibly find sad art appealing. No idea. I have made some depressing pieces, some sad faces. I have made some agonized faces. And I have made some faces of ennui. And I have made what passes for a neutral face, sort of. I realize that's a little disingenuous. And I have made a whole bunch of ecstatic faces. So I categorically deny that my work is depressing. I think there's a lot of stuff that sort of straddles the line between agony and ecstasy. Interesting fact, there's a book by a Philadelphia neurologist called Anjan Chatterjee, and the book is called The Aesthetic Brain. And he talks about how during the moment of orgasm, the expression on a person's face reflects the fact that their pain receptors have turned off. I thought that was interesting. I just found that out recently. I do worry that I will be seen only as an artist who makes quote-unquote images of distraught females against colorful patterned backgrounds. I have been asked over and over again if these are self-portraits. And obviously, they're not intended to be images of my physical self. I see them in some ways as dolls. And when I Googled sources on doll play, I didn't find what I was actually looking for. What I wanted was references to using dolls as proxies for oneself, like how counselors do with abused children, or the use of dolls to cast spells, or even the use of effigies to enact rituals of sympathetic magic and of rituals of sacrifice. That's how I see the figures in my work. They have a job to do. My doll play is a way of creating characters to stand in my place and absorb all the bad feelings and trauma so I don't have to. They aren't me. They're sort of sponges. As a child, I was absolutely obsessed with dolls. My mother told me that when I was older, I would grow out of this. And I remember I was just so distraught that she said that. And unfortunately, she's not around, so I can't tell her that I'm basically still playing with dolls. But I think that they are a form of doll play. There's, let's see, I'm looking at my notes going, should I read this? Anyway, I don't want it to seem totally egotistical because it is my concern that they not just be proxies for me, but proxies for anyone who should benefit by it. They're an every person doll. They're not a little Judy doll. Because I think that's one of the functions of art. Did I miss a slide? Okay. So my philosophy, and one that I am proud to say is about a third grade level, is that as an artist, one can take negative energy and convert it into something potable. So basically, I take bad feelings and I try to make them pretty, and then the problem is solved, right? That's how I think. The apotheosis of our humanity is an ability to connect empathetically with others, and art can be a venue for that. Now, actually, I was just telling you that I read this book by Ellen Winter. She has empirically studied art and empathy, and literally, this is the test they did. I wish she was here because I love the book, but I also really hated this test. I think this is not the best empirical test to find out about art and empathy. They had a whole bunch of volunteers, read Harry Potter, and then they figured out whether or not they donated to charitable causes after reading it. It's like, if art actually did that, that would be pretty cool. But I think that art is the beginning of empathy. I think art involves rehearsal. It's a way of trying out situations that you might not want to actually do in real life. It's a chance to experiment with alternative identities. I think also art can be a place to feel our feelings in a deeper way. It has always struck me that no one on earth ever has asked for help with dealing with their excess of happiness. What we need, if I may be so bold, is examples of constructive ways of dealing with pain and suffering. I always, because I wasn't actually a Christian, imagined that those pictures of saints were not about sadomasochism, but were about making suffering meaningful. I mean, maybe that's the same thing, but I saw it as different. So another reason is to make what people might see as so-called depressing art is that we often won't or can't engage with what is too painful to bear in real life. Art can provide a safe venue for experiencing that stuff because there's no actual loss for the viewer. There's no accompanying trauma or residual emotions that you have to clean up 10 years from now. Now, Ellen Winter does point that out, so it is an awesome book. You can experience sorrow, but without the messy cleanup or expensive therapy. It can bring up issues for people, but it can also be a chance to grow. So my point is that art doesn't cause any fresh wounds. And this is my actual cat, Susie. Susie was a cat with no ego, and she died of stomach cancer. And this is my turning her into a lion. This is the piece, right? And the piece was actually based on this amazing piece that's in the British Museum. I can't speak ancient Persian accurately, but the Lion Hunt of Ashurbanipal. And the wall text says, "Don't be fooled by the fact that the artist seems to be evoking sympathy for the lions. It's all about King Ashurbanipal and his glory." Ashurbanipal, by the way, looks like R2-D2. And, kill lions! And the lions are all like, "Wah!" And I just thought, I don't think we know what those artists thought. I think they had a lot of sympathy for those lions, actually, because I can see it. And I do think that that's sort of part of the point of art. All right, so I also get the question, why glass? It might interest you to know that glass, everything that has a black arrow, glass addresses for me, at least to some extent. As a maker, I really like the fact that technique slowed me way down and put my head where my hands were. When I was a painter, the way painting was taught, and I think still is, because I'm actually still an art teacher, so I can speak with authority on that, come to think of it, is that there's really no technical instruction, and you just have like a creative encounter with a blank canvas. That is a description of my worst day. I do not ever want to have that in my life. So what I used to do as a painter was I used to scribble all over the canvas some expressive marks and then try to turn it into something, and it was very, very frustrating for me. And the glass took at least a week to transform. And what I believe happened in that time was emotional transference, and I wasn't about to throw it in the trash can. So I really like the fact that glass put my head where my hands were. And it couldn't be more important, because that certainly wasn't where it was when I was a painter. When I started working in glass, my first thought, since I didn't know anything about it and was incredibly ignorant, was that no one had done anything with it in centuries, with the exception of Tiffany, who I happened to dislike. At least then I disliked him. I liked the challenge of working with a risky, unpopular tradition, and I particularly liked its neglected history. As it turned out, the distorted, anguished figures in decorative backgrounds that looked like a pantomime of teenage angst when I did them in oil paint looked really authentic in stained glass. Perhaps they needed real illumination to make them look like they were burning inside, and so glass it was. So I will also say there are deeper reasons for working with glass. Attraction to light is a real thing. Anyone, and when I say anyone, I mean other glass artists, who claim that they don't find the transmissive qualities of glass appealing are either liars or glass artists with a giant chip on their shoulder. I love glass. As Abbot Suger said, stained glass is enlightenment embodied, and I mean, who wouldn't want to work in that medium, right? Here's a quote from Aldous Huxley from his essay, Heaven and Hell, in which he discusses the mystical aspect of certain materials, including glass. And the window you see here, believe it or not, is the one that he illustrates his essay with. It's like, that one, really, Aldous? You couldn't find a better window than that? It is Paolo Uccello, but still. And this is the quote: "Religious art has always and everywhere made use of these vision-inducing materials such as glass and gemstones. For Ezekiel, a gem was a stone of fire. Conversely, a flame is a living gem." I'm trying to advance this because it's long. "Endowed with all the transporting power that belongs to the precious stone, and to a lesser degree to polished metal. This transporting power of flame increases in proportion to the depth and extent of the surrounding darkness. The most impressively numinous temples are caverns of twilight, in which a few tapers give light to the transporting otherworldly treasures on the altar. Glass is hardly less effective as an inducer of visions than are natural gems." I love this guy. You can hire him to be my publicist. "In certain respects, indeed, it is more effective, for the simple reason there is more of it. Thanks to glass, a whole building, the Sainte-Chapelle, for example, the Cathedral of Chartres and Sens, could be turned into something magical and transporting. Thanks to glass, Paolo Uccello could design a circular jewel 13 feet in diameter, his great window of the resurrection, perhaps the most extraordinary single work of vision-inducing art ever produced." I'm thinking he was definitely tripping when he saw it. It's great, right? But it's not that great. I did mention at the beginning of this talk that stained glass has a tendency to be deployed in terrible, terrible ways. It promises enlightenment, but it often falls a little short. So glass is one of the few materials that looks good before you even touch it. And that's dangerous, because anything you do to it risks ruining it. And as opposed to clay, which can only go in one direction, and that's up. But glass can be a mystical experience. And although I remain an atheist, I do believe that I have experienced something close to the mystical when it comes to art making, and for this I definitely thank glass. That was Eastern State Penitentiary. You may be wondering why I showed you a picture of a prison. That's Eastern State Penitentiary, and I had the opportunity to do an installation in there. They do host artist installations there every year, and you should all come see them. I have never wavered in my faith that deep knowledge of a material can lead to fluency and even enlightenment that cannot even really begin to be imagined. It's very hard, I think, to explain in words, but sometimes to feel inspired is to feel like you were at the intersection of the here and now and the mind and the body, like the axis mundi, and it feels somewhat ecstatic. And although I take responsibility for having made my work, and although it can be an agonizing pain in the butt or a boring slog, it can still feel like a miracle every time I make something because I've been allowed to be some form of a conduit. All right, so this is the wall at Eastern State Penitentiary where I promised them beautiful rainbows would be cast. So you may not know this, but being labeled a glass artist is a stigma. Obviously, I don't care what weird prejudices other people are comfortable talking about publicly when it comes to craft, art, and glass. And I mean, I believe that I must be a glass artist because every time I make a piece, I decide to make it out of stained glass. So before I conclude, I just want to say a few words about this piece specifically. It was designed to go into Eastern State Penitentiary. I wasn't going to make it at all. The coordinator of the site, a guy named Sean Kelly, pointed to a transom and said, "Hey, Judith, I think you should make a window for that transom." And I said, "Oh, come on, Sean, that's really enormous. Take the rest of my life." And he said, "Well, it'll be your masterpiece." And I thought to myself, well, Sean, I don't know what you know about my masterpieces. And then the old cog started turning, and I thought, Sean said it would be my masterpiece. So I decided to do it after all. It really changed my life, making this piece, in many, many ways, some too personal to tell. But I will say it was designed to be the 7 deadly sins, fighting it out with the 7 cardinal virtues. And there are sort of 7 battles in it, but I discovered that I don't believe in good versus evil. And it just became a giant mishmash of stuff fighting it out. It is based on the piece, The Battle of Carnival and Lent by Pierre Bruegel, one of my favorite artists. So I guess this is kind of like Mardi Gras. And here's some details. You don't really need to see the details because I'd really rather you go look at them in person. It was a piece that it changed my life in many ways, but the most concrete way was that I could not leave the house while I made it because I had to do nothing but make this piece until it was done. Like, it was really nuts. I just slide pizzas under the crack under the door. This body, wearing the really nice sort of tapestry pants, is actually from a Matthew Brady photograph at Antietam Battlefield. But they're sourced from all over the place. Almost all the heads are from my sketchbooks. And then the sort of good versus evil battle is up on the top. And that is it, everybody. I really appreciate you coming and listening. Thank you.